Come, I want to show you how you can make the neckline for your next asymmetrical outfit without gaping or loose fitting. You're welcome to Kemafrik. My name is Kemi Omorugwe. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for coming back. If you're new here, a sub to the channel will make my day. So just keep on watching. I'm sure you'll learn a thing or two from here. Now, as you may know already, we'll be modifying our basic bodice block to create an asymmetrical pattern. I'm starting by drafting my full scale basic bodice block, and I marked the shoulder width 7.5 inches and the neck width of 3.5 by 3.5 inches, and we have our neckline right there. Next, I created my shoulder drop. I made use of 1.5 inches or inch shoulder drop, and created my slanted shoulder line right there. If you want a full tutorial on how to draft your basic bodice block, I'll drop a link in the description box so you can check it out. So right there, I'm marking my chest line. I'll be modifying the armhole a little bit. I marked the middle right there and marked 0.75 inches inward, and we have our armhole curve right there. So next, I am marking the other vertical measurements. I marked out my bust line, marked out the waistline, and also the hip line, which is doubling up as the length of this full scale bodice. So I just did the same thing on another point on the paper so that I can have straight lines right here. And we have our bust line, waist line, and the hip line, which is actually the hem of this bodice. So I went ahead to measure the distance between the waistline and the hip line because I will need it when I am creating the back bodice. Now the bust pan I'm using is 8 inches, so I divided it by 2 to get the position of my dart. I marked it on the bust line, the waistline, and the hip line, and we have a straight dart line right there. So on the chest line, I am marking the bust circumference divided by 4. On the hip line, I'm marking the hip circumference divided by 4 plus additional 1.5 inch, which is the width of my dart. And on the hip line, I have the hip circumference divided by 4. Now I'm marking the dart line. I made use of a slightly wider dart, not the 1 inch wide dart. So I made use of 0.75 inch rather on both sides of the dart. Okay, so that means the entire width of the dart is 1.5. I came downward from the bust line by 1 inch to mark out my dart, and on the hip line as well, I came upward by 1 inch. So now I want to create an armhole princess dart. So I marked the center of my armhole right there and connected it to the bust point. And because we want to tighten the dart line, the armhole dart right there, I came downward by 1 inch and created another dart. So because this dart has the possibility of being smaller than the other one, you want to extend it by additional 1 inch right there. So at the chest line, I measured the dart intake and added it to the chest line right there so that we don't have any deficit on our pattern. So right here, I am connecting the chest line to the waistline and to the hip line. I forgot to mention that because you are making an asymmetrical pattern, you need a full bodice. The center front of this pattern is actually on fold so that I can transfer all that I've done so far to the other side. If you'd like to learn how to draft a basic bodice block, I have a detailed tutorial. I will drop the link above and in the description box. Please go and check it out. This bodice was drafted using the bust dart technique. Please go ahead and input your bust darts along the side of the front pattern. I gave a detailed explanation of how the bust dart works in the video I spoke about earlier on. For this particular asymmetrical neckline, we are making use of an off shoulder for one side, while the other side will just be a regular shoulder. So you need to measure the depth of the off shoulder you need. I made use of 5 inches, so I measured the upper part of my bodice and I got 4 inches, so I added additional 1 inch from the other side of the dart. Okay, I didn't include the armhole dart right there. So from here I will then modify my neckline along the shoulder. You can decide to make the shoulder smaller or wider as you wish. Okay, but for me I made use of 3 inches wide shoulder, so I came inward by 1 inch from the neckline, just so my shoulder is smaller and towards the side. Okay, so you are free to create this as you want. I like to go in first with my pencil, and from then I'll mark it out so that you guys can visibly see it. So for the shape of the neckline, you can decide to modify it as you want. You may want like a sharp V, okay, off shoulder V neckline. I think I did that for the back, but for this I decided to make use of a curve. You can make it like a sweetheart neckline, and just know that you are free to create as you wish, but this is what I did for mine. Now I will be cutting out this pattern and removing the dart, then closing up the bust dart or transferring the bust dart to the waist. So let's go ahead. Now for the bust dart, like I mentioned, I am transferring it to the waist, so we have the bust line being closed right there. I'll tape it down to stabilize it. And also at the hem of this pattern, we need to make the side a little curvy. Okay, you don't want sharp edges at the side right there, so I came upward by 1 inch and I am blending it into the other part of the pattern. Note that I did this for the 2 side pieces only. Okay, you don't need to do the same thing for the center piece. So I'll cut out this little curve right here, and we have a ready pattern. I'll be doing this same thing on the side panel for the back as well. Now let's move on to creating the back pattern. For the back pattern, like you know already, we need a zipper allowance. I made use of 1 inch wide zipper allowance, and there I am creating my neckline. I made use of the same 3.5 inches neck width and a 1 inch neck depth for this. So once again, we have a shoulder drop, so I'm marking out the width of the shoulder right there and dropping it by 1 inch, and we'll create a slanted shoulder line. Here I am marking my armhole depth because I want to create the chest line and the armhole curve. Just like I did on the front bodies, at the center of this line, I'll be marking half an inch inward as opposed to 3/4 of an inch that I used for the front pattern. And here I am creating my armhole curve. Next, I'll be marking out the waistline and the hip line. So my waistline for the back is just 2 inches less than what I had for the front. You can work with your own measurement, but the distance between the waistline and the hip line must be constant, okay, so that the entire pattern is still 2 inches shorter than the front, but the difference is from the shoulder to the waist. Okay, so I have inputted my circumferences, that's the bust circumference, the waist circumference, and the hip circumference, and now I am creating my dart line. I made use of the same 4 inches I used for the front, but the width of the dart I use for the back is just the 1 inch wide dart, okay, half an inch on both sides of the dart leg. Now, like I did for the front pattern, I'll be transferring this pattern to the other side. The center front is on fold, but before I do that, I want to create a back tightening. So I made use of 0.75 inch for this. You can go ahead to make use of half an inch or even 1 inch, depending on the level of tightening you want. So this means that our zipper allowance is still there, it is still active, it is still 1 inch wide, just that we have a slightly slanted pattern. Now for this pattern, I decided to extend my armhole dart a little bit. Note that we didn't do any tightening for the back, okay? You don't need to do that, but I extended this by just half an inch so that when I'm joining the two panels together, I won't have a deficit. Now here is something I love to do because I think it makes the whole thing easier for me. I hold down the pattern along the zip allowance using my pins, okay, so that way we have two patterns that are actually together, okay, and I just ignore the zipper allowance right there. So before I go ahead to cut, now we have our pattern opened. I am highlighting the tracing I did initially. Now I will be opening up the zipper allowance on both sides, okay, just opening it up like so, so that by the time I mark out my neckline, my zipper allowance won't be shorter or longer than the side it is representing, okay. I hope you understand what I mean. So for the neck depth or the neck style line, you can decide to modify this, make it V shape, make it curvy. You also have the option of replicating exactly what you did on the front pattern. Because the zipper allowance is opened and the front and back are, you know, very similar along the top, you can align the center of the front pattern with the center of this pattern and just mark out the exact same neckline you use for the front. That's an option, but I went ahead to create a V-shaped neckline for mine. Note, however, that you must have the same shoulder width, okay, starting from the same point. So I went inward by 1 inch from the neckline on the shoulder and marked out the shoulder, the new back neckline. So for the other side, I decided to also make it straight, and I just marked half 5 inches downward, because that was what we used for the front, and I connected it to the zipper allowance right there. So here I'll be cutting out this pattern, separating our panels so that we have our back bodice ready. Now, so that I won't have any sagginess along the side of this off shoulder, I like to modify the armhole a little bit. So from the original armhole line, I marked 1 inch inward just to tighten that part a little bit. Okay, I realized that when I do this, it helps the sleeve sit better than without it. Now let's come back to the front pattern. I didn't remember to do the tightening along the off shoulder armhole right here. So I also came inward by 1 inch like I did for the back, and modifying the armhole for the off shoulder right there. Also note that your armhole curve doesn't have to be deep for the off shoulder. I just like to make use of a very slight curve right here, and this tightening helped me achieve that. Our patterns are ready. Here is the back pattern pieces. Now, in case you are curious on how to work on the sleeve, one of the sleeve will be a regular sleeve, so you don't need any modification, while the other sleeve will be an off-shoulder sleeve. You can check out the full tutorial I created on how to draft an off-shoulder bodice and sleeve pattern. Okay, so another option, however, is to work with your basic sleeve. So I will usually align the sleeve with the side of the off-shoulder, the armhole of the off-shoulder part of this pattern. Okay, so and I'll mark the length on my sleeve right here, so I know exactly where to cut out from this basic sleeve pattern. So I'll usually go in with my ruler, draw a straight line and just modify the straight line to be slightly curvy. Watch me do this. I can now cut this out and we have the sleeve pattern ready. Thank you for watching this far. I went ahead to transfer these patterns to fabric, and we'll be sewing an asymmetrical neckline piece in the next tutorial.